The 1970s would be a turbulent time for comic books, and some insiders in the industry really felt that this was the end of comic books as we know it. However, when we got to the 1980s, we would see a pretty dramatic shift in the comic book industry. The economic conditions in the early 1980s didn't help. Any of you who were around during that time know how very difficult the recession between 1980 and 1982 was. Yet, somehow, the comic book industry made it through and somehow even grew stronger in those really tough economic times. Let's talk about how this happened, as well as the watershed year for Marvel comic books, that was 1982. For decades, publishers sold their comic books through a system that allowed returns from retailers. And the distribution system worked fine, but in the 1970s, things changed. Higher return rates, along with a shrinking number of newsstands and retailers, really hit the publishers hard. But something else happened in the later 1970s, and that's the emergence of your local comic book store. Now, how did this happen? For the longest time, comic book distribution was handled through channels that also distributed other periodicals or magazines like Sports Illustrated, Cosmopolitan, and Playboy. Comic books were often considered second class compared to the money-making machines that these other magazines were. If you were a comic book reader, you couldn't be certain if your local newsstand would always have the current issue of Howard the Duck. Certainly, there was a demand for these comic books, as well as a reliable outlet to buy them every month. Enter the comic book store. Now, these comic book specialty stores had been around for a while, even before the 1970s, but they would get their comic books from an independent distributor wholesaler who would typically only give a 30% discount from cover price. Now, these are really tough margins to make money on just selling comic books. What happened in the late 1970s through to the early 1980s was a game changer. This was the rapid growth of the direct market. Or basically, you started to see comic book stores pop up all over the place. And the reason for this is the rapid evolution of the wholesale distribution system of comic books. When you talk about the early direct market distribution system, you have to talk about Phil Seuling. Now, Phil Seuling was a huge fan of comic books, and as a side hustle, he developed his own wholesale comic book business. He made deals with publishers to buy directly from them at a discount comparable to the really big distributors, on the condition that he could not return the comic books. And you have to remember, for newsstands and retailers, they were able to return unsold comic books. Phil would then wholesale these comic books to comic book shops on a non-returnable basis. And this actually started way back in 1972, and the company he formed was called Seagate. The benefit for comic book stores was twofold. They would get a much bigger discount on new comic books, and they would also get them faster, usually a week before the newsstands did. This was a big advantage for comic book stores, like using Seagate as their wholesaler. Seagate grew quickly, and as a result, a number of sub-distributors under Seagate were created to help manage the logistics of a rapidly increasing amount of comic books being distributed through them. However, they were the only distributor for comic book stores, a monopoly, and had some rigid rules to adhere to as a comic book retailer. And for one, they didn't extend any credit for retailers, which meant that you had to pay up front for your pre-orders. Sometimes it would be months before a comic book you ordered actually arrived, and that can add a lot of stress to your monthly bottom line. If you've ever been a small business owner, you know that cash flow is really important, and you can't afford to have money tied up in a product that you just don't know when it's going to arrive. It's very tough for business. Seagate essentially ran a monopoly until 1979, when Urjax threatened to file an antitrust lawsuit. And I'm not going to go into too many details here, but what essentially happened was that Marvel opened the door to essentially anyone to become a comic book distributor. The terms were pretty easy. You only had to have like $3,000 in purchases, and you would get a 60% discount, free shipping, as well as 30-day billing. You wouldn't have to settle until a month later. And as a result, the direct market would start to snowball and then explode. New comic book distributors would start entering the market, serving their geographic locations, and more comic book specialty stores would start opening up. These are some rough estimates, but in terms of overall sales of comic books, you would start to see a dramatic shift from newsstand to direct market or these comic book specialty stores. In 1979, approximately 6% of all Marvel comic book sales were to the direct market. And in 1982, it would be about 20%. And it would rapidly grow to about 50% in 1985. What was also interesting was that these increased sales were not eating into newsstand sales. Sales at newsstands were pretty flat, but the number of sales through these direct markets were starting to explode. Marvel would also do something to help out comic book retailers, and that would be to make a few exclusives for them. The first being Dazzler #1. Dazzler #1 sold an astonishing 428,000 copies. That was an insane number for that time in 1980. I just want to quickly show you this, and this is the standard catalog of comic books that came out in 2002, and there are a few more editions that came out after this. And this has just a wealth of information on comic books and more detailed information specifically with regards to print runs. So as an example, if you look at the Avengers over here, you can see that there are specific information with regards to prices, but specifically to print runs. So a great resource for information like this if you are a like a data nerd like me who likes all this kind of detailed information. This is the standard catalog of comic books. Just to show you how things were changing so quickly, take a look at this internal memo that had sales figures from Marvel from Jim Shooter from his blog. The change from 1982 to 1983 is huge. From year to year, the total increase in sales is 34%. And if you compare the December figures, the year-to-year growth was larger at 42%. So the growth was accelerating. And again, this is worth repeating. These additional sales were not cannibalizing any of the newsstand sales at that time. In 1982, Marvel would launch a very popular and lucrative series called G.I. Joe. Larry Hama would be the driving force behind the series, and it would be immensely popular with comic book fans. There would be a very successful toy line, along with a popular TV cartoon series that would run for a few years. This formula would later be repeated again with a lot of success with the Transformers. Other interesting experiments included tie-ins to video games, like DC's Atari Force, where they included comic books with video game purchases. And Atari Force would later have their own title. Let's take a look at some of the comic books from my comic book collection that came out that year. So in 1982, Marvel published its first limited series, Contest of Champions, and it was a really big event in a way that it featured all the Marvel superheroes that were currently in the Marvel Universe. And it was a massive crossover, and it was as well the first comic book that I ever owned. It's not this copy, but it was given to me as a party favor along with a Master of Kung Fu at a birthday party. And it really was the comic book that really got me interested in comic books because it featured all these heroes and it was pretty wonderful. The limited series format would then be used quite a bit by Marvel and DC going forward, as it was a good way to kind of, showcase characters as well as kind of gauge maybe whether or not a character can have its own title. Another big event was the Marvel and DC present Uncanny X-Men and New Teen Titans. Now, Marvel and DC would do collaborative, stories before, like you had, the Superman Spider-Man crossover as well as other things, but this would be the last one they would do for a while because they would work on a JLA Avengers one, but the conflicts or the issues that arose between the two publishers at that time basically killed the relationship for a little bit. X-Men and the New Teen Titans were the two big titles for Marvel and DC at that time, and this one did extremely well. And it's a very good story. While I don't have G.I. Joe #1 anymore, I have maybe the next best thing, and that's Team America. This is probably one of the worst comic books that Marvel published in the 80s, but it's still got a great cover by Bob Layton. And this one is a newsstand, and this one is a direct edition. But the series would only last 12 issues, and once the rights kind of lapsed, they actually changed the name to something else. This is the New Teen Titans #21, and what's significant about this is it's also the first appearance of Night Force, which is by Marv Wolfman and Gene Colan. Marv Wolfman and Gene Colan are much better known for their run in Tomb of Dracula, arguably the best horror run to come out in the 1970s, and it ran like 70 issues. And so what happened in the 80s quite a bit was that a lot of talent would go back and forth for Marvel and for DC. You know, they would sign contracts, but they would work for hire. So this would allow them to go back and forth. And Gene Colan had left Marvel and then went to DC at this time. DC would also experiment with a new paper format, a deluxe format, and they started with this maxi series called Camelot 3000. Camelot 3000 was a very popular, a very hot title when it came out. Wonderful artwork by Brian Bolland, but what killed it was just the scheduling of the issues. Like later the series, like the gaps between the issues became greater and greater, and I think between issues 11 and 12, there was like a 1 year gap, which effectively just kills a title. So that was really unfortunate, but it was a very popular title when it came out. Marvel also released its Epic line of comics, and the flagship title of this would be Dreadstar by Jim Starlin. Now, you know, there was also a graphic novel that preceded this, and as well as the Metamorphosis Odyssey that was published in Epic magazine. But Dreadstar would be the flagship title for Epic, and this was a way of giving creators rights and more control over their comic books. And one of the reasons why Marvel did this was because there were new independent publishers like PC, Pacific Comics, that were starting to recruit talent from the other publishers and giving them a very high royalty rate, or a royalty rate, whereas Marvel and DC just didn't at that time. Basically, what PC did was it, like DC and Marvel soon implemented their own royalty plan for their creators, giving them a lot more money. In some cases, for very popular titles like X-Men, like Chris Claremont, John Byrne, some of the top tier talent would make a lot of money for themselves during Marvel at this time. I also want to mention Blackhawk, that was published by DC, and this is the new reboot by Mark Evanier and Dan Spiegel. I started collecting Blackhawk a few years ago, and this run in the 1980s really is very good, and you know, much better than the stuff that came out in the 70s and the late 60s. But I would highly recommend that you check out Blackhawk. And I just want to show a Supergirl #1. And Supergirl, this would be her second title. She had a short run in the 1970s, and this one would last a bit longer. But this also has a preview for the Masters of the Universe, and this is when the publishers were really making an effort to tie in toys with their comic books. And some of them would be very successful, like Masters of the Universe and G.I. Joe, and others would not. I do own some graded books, and a significant series that came out in '82 was the Wolverine Limited series by Chris Claremont and Frank Miller. And this was a landmark series. Wolverine was a very popular character in X-Men, and I think Marvel knew that, and I think it was only a matter of time before he got his own tryout series that would eventually become his own series. And As everybody knows, Wolverine is one of the most popular characters in the Marvel Universe, and the 4-issue limited series was amazing. It was like, I think, everything you would have wanted for a Wolverine limited series. Chris Claremont and Miller did an amazing job. And, just to show that I do have like one of the first trade paperbacks of that series. And I always thought it was interesting because in the comic book, the ninjas are kind of red, but on this cover they are black. And it's just because in comic books, it's very difficult to kind of color characters that are wearing fully black. So that's why they did that kind of red tint. And speaking of red, Daredevil 181 was also a huge comic book event that year, and that was the death of Elektra. And it was, I think, a really shocking event for a lot of readers. They just wouldn't expect a main character like Elektra to die. Well, like, die, air quotes. But it was a really big event, a really big moment in Daredevil. And Daredevil and Frank Miller would, at this point, start to become like a very popular character for Marvel. It's one of my favorite runs of all time in comic books. And it's, if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. Like actually both the Wolverine limited series and Daredevil are some of the peak comic books that come out of the 1980s. And this is when Marvel really was starting to kick it into high gear. This is a copy of Warrior number 6, which came out in 1982, and very notable for V for Vendetta and Marvel Man, which a lot of people know are more familiar with as Miracle Man. The first issue had the first appearance of Miracle Man and V for Vendetta, but the talent that worked on these magazines, it's quite something else. Specifically, the artists like Alan Davis, Steve Dillon, David Lloyd, of course, who did V for Vendetta. And these were black and white magazines. And V for Vendetta ran in many of the issues, but was never finished. And DC picked it up later after the success of Watchmen, and Alan Moore and David Lloyd finished the series. You can generally find Warrior magazines, I think. They're not too expensive, except for the first issue. The first issue can be very pricey, but these are really excellent comic books. This is the Absolute V for Vendetta edition hardcover, and this is beautiful if you can find it. It is the complete 12-issue series, but what they also do in this is they have like these kind of full-page panels, which are really nice. But I showed you Warrior before, and this is a very difficult way to read V for Vendetta because really they're just kind of short snippets. So it's having the trade paperback or something like this is a much nicer way. Now you'll notice that this is color, and I think what they did was a beautiful job choosing the right color palette for this series because really, like, V for Vendetta is how would you say, it's a very harsh look at what what the future of the world could potentially look like, especially from what was going on in the early 80s, like the recession and all the it's a very harsh commentary by Moore and Lloyd, but it's in my opinion one of the finest comic book series ever published. What's nice about this is they also have additional unpublished artwork and sketches. I cannot highly recommend this series enough. One of the most important comic books to come out of 1982, and that's V for Vendetta. So there you go. 1982 was a massive year for Marvel and for comic books in general. Here you really started to see the accelerated growth of the comic book market. And this was, by and large driven by like local comic book stores. This was the beginning of another golden age for Marvel comic books, the third one. The first one being in the early 1940s with the creation of characters like Captain America, the Human Torch, and Submariner. The second in the 1960s with the introduction of many new characters, creating a new Marvel age of comics. And in the 1980s with comic books surging back into popularity with new properties, new formats, and new creators. How long would this last? Well, the comic books had a really good spell in the 1980s. And, specifically in the mid to later 1980s, I think 1986 was probably the best year ever for comic books. But, alas, all good things must come to an end. And this is another great subject for another video. Thanks for watching, and until next time, read and enjoy your comic books.